Professor Glaeser has a very long and distinguished resume, but in his modesty, he asked me to keep it brief, so I'll do that. It's actually quite difficult. Professor Edward Glaeser is a Fred and Eleanor Gimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He received his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1992 and has been at Harvard University ever since. An expert in urban economic growth, geographic concentration, crime, social capital, and a host of other topics, Professor Glaeser has been credited with single-handedly, or almost single-handedly, reviving the study of urban conditions, in modern economics. He's the current director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and the director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. In addition to his academic teaching and writing, Professor Glaeser has produced over the course of his career regular columns for the New York Sun, for the Boston Globe, and for the New York Times. His latest book is titled Triumph of the City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. The book promises to explain, among other things, why cities like Chicago have thrived in the past and what they ought to do to thrive in the future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Glaeser.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here, although hopefully I will in fact get out on my flight, which was moved earlier to try and, I feel like I'm trying to get the last plane out of Cairo right now. But if I have to be stuck, I can't think of a place that I'd rather be stuck than in Chicago. I want to just start by seconding the words of Professor Zimmer. Certainly, the 4 years that I spent at the University of Chicago were the most important intellectual years of my life. And I learned more here than I had in my 4 years at some college in New Jersey. And I learned more then than I have since then at some college in Cambridge. I also really want to second the words of President Zimmer on the connection between the city and the university and how special and how precious that is. Because certainly no small part of my own decision to spend my life studying cities came out of the connection between the city and the university. And I'm really delighted. This may not be entirely obvious because, of course, the photo's been distorted, but this is Chicago on the cover of my book. And I was so pleased when Penguin decided to do that, because I really do love this city a lot. So on to the substance, although this is a lunch conversation, so don't expect anything too hard. But I want to start with a paradox, which is that we live in a world in which we live in an age in which transportation and communication costs have vanished away to nothingness. When it is, cheap and effortless to email across the globe, to telecommute in from any low-density place that you wanted. Now, you might have thought that that ability to electronically connect across oceans and continents would have made cities obsolete. You would have thought that we wouldn't bother putting up with all the stress of, living on top of each other and commuting using public transportation and the high prices of urban living, given that, heck, you can just telecommute in from some lower cost, convenient area. That was certainly what many pundits were predicting 15 years ago, was that the death of distance would make cities obsolete. But the odd thing is, that hasn't happened. That along almost every measure, cities are more vital than ever. That's certainly true in the developed world, where cities have become, cities are the most economically productive parts of the United States. They have housing prices have risen, populations of many of them have gone up after enjoying decades of straight decline. But it's even more true in the developing world, where perhaps from an American perspective, Bangalore just looks like it's on the end of the world and there's no, it's just distance-less. From an Indian perspective, it's proximity itself, right? You come to Bangalore to be part of this amazing cauldron of smart people who are learning from one another and teaching from one another, and it's all about being there. Now, we see this stuff, just wanted to put up a few facts. So, of course, it's almost completely true that urbanization and income are the same thing across countries, right? Doesn't mean, of course, that being more urbanized is causing people to have higher incomes, but it certainly does mean that the development process is intimately bound together with the creation of cities. And surely that's why we think that the fact that half the world is now urbanized, that trend will only continue. And certainly the largest challenges facing cities over the next century will be in the great growing cities of Asia. This is the great, dichotomy of a city like Bangalore. On one side, you see the Mindtree campus, right? Sleek, cool, modern, guys from Singapore are there, guys from, everybody's, couldn't feel more first world. On the other hand, you go outside in the streets and you still have major league urban health problems, problems in the provision of clean water. And this is in some sense why it's so important to grapple with cities, because their promise is enormous, but cities involve tremendous management problems as well. The same density that enables us to work together, learn from one another, makes it also easier for us to rob each other or infect each other. And dealing with the downsides of density is one of the great will be, one of the great challenges of the 21st century. This is the relationship between gross metropolitan product per capita in the US and the metropolitan area size. So there's a very strong positive relationship between people living in bigger cities, bigger metropolitan areas, and the amount of output per capita. There have been reams of scientific work on this, trying to figure out various reverse causality issues, various selection issues, and so forth. But I think the weight of scientific opinion seems to suggest that this actually really does reflect the enormous productivity that comes from massing people in one great place like Chicago. This is the relationship between housing value and city population. It's not as if there's a free lunch in cities as in any place else, right? If you're going to, if you're going to have a place that's more productive, that's more fun, you're going to have to pay for it. And that's the other side of this. In fact, in some sense, the high housing price of cities, high housing price is a sign that cities are actually doing well, because they're actually reflecting the fact that people are willing to pay high amounts for them. Now, the story that I'm going to tell, I'm going to give you a little bit of history first, but the story that I'm going to tell is that the reason for this paradox, the reason that cities have become more vital, is that what globalization and new technologies have done is that they've increased the returns to being smart, right? And there are hundreds of papers that have been written showing the rise in returns to human capital, that new innovations, new knowledge are worth more today than they ever have been in the past. Now, our defining characteristic as a species, our greatest asset, is our ability to learn from one another. We come out of the womb hungry for knowledge and able to sop up things from people around us. It's what the University of Chicago is all about, right? It's about the fact that you put smart people in a room together and they become much more powerful than they were alone. They become much more creative. They become much more innovative than they were alone. That's how cities work as well. Cities, since, Socrates and Plato argued on an Athenian street corner, cities have been about the exchange of ideas. And cities have long succeeded by creating human capital, by being engines of innovation and forges of human capital. That skill, that ability of cities to function has become ever more valuable with globalization and new technologies. It's the fact that cities, like universities, make people smart that lies at the root of their success. But I'm going to start with just a little bit of history beforehand, because I think it's worthwhile putting things in perspective. So for anyone like myself who grew up in the difficult days of the 1970s, the current recession doesn't seem that bad, right? If you go back to 1975, right, when cities like Chicago and New York had been shedding hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs, it looked like not just President Ford, but history itself was telling them to drop dead, right? That basically this seemed to be a form whose time had come and gone. That's Jimmy Carter, of course, walking around the South Bronx. Now, the reason for that is that cities' initial raison d'etre had essentially become irrelevant by the 1970s. So cities, all of America's older, colder cities, formed to take advantage of certain transportation advantages, right? So New York City grows great during the early years of the 19th century. It grows great as the country's largest port. And what happens is that you have in the early 19th century a shift from smaller ships, 200, 300-ton ships, to bigger ships, 2,000, 3,000-ton ships. And those bigger ships, like 747s today, were much better suited for hub and spoke transportation than for point to point. So if you have a small plane, you run it from Dubuque to Des Moines or whatever you're doing. Once you have larger planes, you fly the thing through Chicago and you put it on a smaller plane going somewhere else. It's the same thing with ships. And what happens in the early 19th century is the move to larger ships means that you move from having Baltimore to Liverpool, Boston to Liverpool, and so forth, to a much more centralized shipping center. And the natural place to put that is New York. It's in the center of the country. It's got a great natural port. And then it's supplements that port with additional forms of waterborne transportation, like the Erie Canal. You can't overestimate the importance of water in the early 19th century. It cost as much to move goods 32 miles over land as it did to have them cross the Atlantic, right? That's the degree of advantage that the elimination of friction due to water actually creates. New York's manufacturing growth, all of its early industries, are all then structured around the port. Right? The great early industries are sugar refining, the largest industry by value during the early 19th century. That's the fortune, by the way, the family fortune that eventually put FDR in the White House, is old Isaac Roosevelt's 18th century sugar refining money. Garment production and printing and publishing. In all of these cases, the thing is built around the port, right? Why is printing and publishing in the port? Well, the big money in 19th century printing and publishing is printing pirated English novels. Right? They had good writers, and our laws certainly didn't protect them, right? I mean, the Chinese today had nothing on the 19th century New Yorkers. And this is how New York got its advantage, was that the Harper brothers could print books like Peveril of the Peak faster than their Philadelphia competitors could, faster than Carey and Lee could in Philadelphia, because the boat got to New York first, and they could flood the market with the things before Carey and Lee were able to set a single piece of type. Right? Sugar refining is very natural. New York, the port that's connecting with the Caribbean, raw sugar is coming north. You can't refine raw sugar in the Caribbean because the crystals coalesce during a long, hot sea voyage. So you take advantage of economies of scale and you put it in New York. Garment production, right? Huge market in New York, and gosh, you got a lot of cotton and textiles moving through New York already. A natural place to put the garment trade. All of these industries built around the transportation technology. Chicago's story is not dissimilar, right? I mean, the stockyards that were so famous were built around the railroad, right? Chicago's origins, of course, predate the railroad, and its first big, real estate boom occurs during the 1830s around the prospect of the Illinois and Michigan Canal. And in some sense, there was no city that was more foreordained to be the gem of the prairies than Chicago, right? It's the linchpin of a great watery arc that goes all the way from New Orleans to New York. How could the city possibly not win? And then, of course, it's only supplemented by this tremendous, investment in rail lines that gave Chicago a great comparative advantage in moving goods, right? I think I have a picture of those cows. I have a distant relative who was president of the stockyards in the 1920s. So, the economics of this are totally straightforward, right? Let me see if I have the. I have the things. In 1889, Iowa's yield per acre of corn was 41 bushels. Illinois was 37. The older corn belt of the country, Kentucky, which fed into Cincinnati, America's erstwhile porkopolis, right, was only 27 bushels. The labor needed to farm an acre of corn was about double in the Northeast than it was in the Old West, right? Huge advantages towards farming this area. But the problem was getting the corn east. Well, pigs are corn in porcine form, right? Pigs enable the cheap transmission of those corn calories east. And cows, once they were able to be refrigerated, which was one of those innovations that came out of Chicago, were able to do the exact same thing. So I think that's the sort of model that you should have in mind, that America's West was won not by cowboys, or not much by cowboys, but by people like Armour and Swift, but by urban entrepreneurs who actually figured out how to make that wealth accessible. And cities like Chicago were crucial in the winning of the West. Detroit's story is similar, right? Detroit starts out as being a great interior port, huge amounts of traffic going through the straits that gave the city its name. And then, as in Chicago, one of the things that's remarkable is that even when cities form for utterly prosaic reasons, even when they form to take advantage of simple transportation cost economies, magic happens, because people connect with each other and learn from one another and become smarter from one another. The story, and I urge you, I snuck out earlier to see the Louis Sullivan exhibit downstairs, and of course we're in hallowed space here. But the story of how the skyscraper formed is a great example of this, right? Of a bunch of architects who stole from one another and learned from one another and copied each other and collectively created masterpieces and made cities function, right? The story of the car is not too different, right? Silicon Valley, here I have a picture of this thing. Silicon Valley this is Henry Ford, that's Detroit Dry Dock. Right? Silicon Valley in the 1970s looked a lot like Detroit did in the 1900s. Right? There was essentially an automotive genius on every street corner, all of which were competing like mad and furiously borrowing each other's ideas. Detroit was actually a fairly natural place to put cars, as it was a place that had both great expertise in engines because of its role as an interior port. And that's where Henry Ford got his training in engines. It was at Detroit Dry Dock. Now, of course, like so many buildings in Detroit, an empty hull. of a building. And of course, Billy Durant came out of the carriage trade, the other thing that was big in Detroit, of actually making carriages, which took advantage of the wood in Michigan. That wood, of course, is also why Seattle has aviation, is that Boeing took advantage of the cheap wood in the Seattle area. But while Detroit, was able to be incredibly productive in producing cars, it helped set in motion the great trend that would cause so much trouble for cities in the 20th century. And that great trend is really captured by this graph, which is the decline in cost of moving a ton of mile by rail. And keep in mind, this is only rail, right? If rail showed this much improvement, this is an over 90% decline in the real cost of moving goods by rail. Okay? And this doesn't take into account the car and the plane and the truck and the highway system and all of the other things that meant that whereas in 1900 it was enormously difficult to move goods over space, by 1970 it became much closer to rounding error. And the seemingly unbreakable hold that the Middle West had along manufacturing that came in part from this incredible distribution network that it had pioneered, that hold became irrelevant. And production, whereas in as late as 1950, the overwhelming majority of American cities were over-concentrated in manufacturing. They had more manufacturing than the country did as a whole. 40 years later, all but Los Angeles and Detroit were under-concentrated in manufacturing, had less manufacturing than did the country as a whole. The freeing up, the reduction in transportation costs enabled this great migration within the US, the move towards warmer areas. And there's no variable that better predicts the growth of cities, the population growth of cities during the 20th century than January temperature. It's a sad fact to mention on a day like today in Chicago, but it's hard to repeal the weather. And this is just 1980 January temperature on population growth, 1980 to 2000. And this was something else, obviously, that hit the older, colder cities like Chicago, was the fact that there were a bunch of technological changes, both the freeing up of industry from the old transportation networks, the fact that there were heat-biased technological change, there were things like the air conditioner and the eradication of southern diseases, and of course the politics switched from being a very difficult place to do business in the 1930s and 40s. The South adopted a much more pro-business attitude, particularly after right-to-work laws came along, which have been shown to have a demonstrably positive effect on manufacturing growth. Central cities were hit twice. Right? So central cities were hit by the regional move to the Sun Belt, but they were also hit by the move out to the suburbs, and certainly Chicago has experienced that. There are few metropolitan areas with as decentralized employment as the Chicago metropolitan area. It's certainly one of the most dispersed of all metropolitan areas. And basically you want to think that the world has always organized its cities around the prevalent transportation technology during the era in which it's built. Right? Chicago reflects its streetcars and its elevated rails. Right? The suburbs actually reflect the car. And the attraction of the car is not surprising. The car is just typically a much faster way to get around. The average car commute in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transportation is 48 minutes. If you look across metropolitan areas, this is the share across cities. This is the relationship between the share of the population using public transportation and the share of and the amount of time the average commute takes, right? Typically, there's a 15 to 20 minute fixed cost involved in public transportation of getting there, waiting for the thing to arrive, and then getting where it drops you off. Unsurprisingly, Americans chose to invest in cars, and the government certainly did all it could to encourage them doing it, as it continues to do. The infrastructure stimulus funding during the recent bill went disproportionately to low-density states, and one has to wonder how many highways we actually need in Montana. And we built things like this. The top one is Levittown, sort of the post-war suburb. It was actually still a mixed model. People were still taking trains as well as driving. Below is the Woodlands, right, which is a much more modern, enormously successful car-based area outside of Houston. And this is it's important not to just think that these places are awful and move on. Right? Anyone who sort of loves cities has to realize that they're also delivering something. And one of the things they're delivering is relatively fast commutes. And the other thing is reasonably good schools and reasonably attractive living arrangements. And cities actually need to know what they're competing against, just like any private sector firm would. The result of these changes was that urban decline was almost uniform. What you're looking at is, you may not recognize them at first, these were the 10 largest cities in the country in 1950. Okay? And what you're seeing is how much population they lost between 1950 and 2000. All but two have less population now than they did then. Chicago, which only lost where 20% of its population, actually came off remarkably well, certainly relative to Detroit, down 50%, Cleveland down 50%, St. Louis down 50%. St. Louis down 60%. So this is something that sort of all the older cities were hit by. And accompanying the economic decline was the tremendous social chaos. This is a picture, of course, of the Detroit riot that destroyed more than 2,000 buildings. And, the decline of these cities were not helped by the policies that were undertaken to try and fix decline. So the way, at least I would start off by thinking about decline, is that the hallmark of a declining city is it actually has lots of infrastructure relative to demand. Right? It's got lots of empty roads. It's got lots of, put a picture of it. It's got lots of empty roads. It's got lots of cheap buildings, right? The last thing, more than 90% of the housing in the city of Detroit costs significantly less than construction costs, okay? It is madness to think that these places need new infrastructure, that this is how you're going to fight demand. It's not what they need. And yet, what did we do in Detroit? We built a people mover. We built a monorail that glides over empty streets. Okay, how can that possibly make sense? You heard Mayor Daley this morning speak quite correctly that by far the most important city service is education. Cities rely on people to make them come back, and cities that actually have fast commutes already certainly don't need people movers. We can tell the same stories about housing projects or any number of the physical products. And I think there's a constant mistake, which is so terrible in cities, that the city is not the structures. It's the people inhabiting those structures. And you want to build those structures if and only if there is demand. There's no sense in Potemkin villages that happen to look nice. Cleveland over and over again declared itself a comeback city associated with some form of glamorous new structure that was subsidized and built downtown. That's not a comeback city. A comeback city is when the people are employed, when there's new entrepreneurship, when there are new ideas, when there's new innovation coming out of it. This is the kind of thing that represents this is the kind of thing that makes a successful city work.